here. I'm Catherine Lester-Bacon. I'm the Director of Religious Life, who oversees the consortium of chaplains and campus ministers here on campus. We at the Duke Chapel are the conveners and the support and the advocates for religious life here on campus. So we stand at a really beautiful intersection of student care and spiritual diversity, and so I celebrate that by standing here today. I am happy to have been working with Chaplain Priya Amaresh and Dr. Samrat Das to have this event happen. I will just say that when Duke University was founded 100 years ago, there was not yet a vision of such richness of religious diversity that we have here today, that we can see all around us. But there was, even 100 years ago, a deep vision to make space, to build a physical space with mortar and stones and years of labor, to build a space and make space for the spiritual life of students on campus. And the chapel was built. The chapel itself, that big building you see on many publicity materials, as well as the one you walked past, it was built out of this desire, this initiative, this belief that students and the students' education was more than just what they learned in a classroom, but it was the lessons they learned alongside the habits they developed and the mentors they followed, the paths they trod, and the spiritual life they pursued. That all of these things were part of the education of the Duke student from the very beginning. Over the years, new programs and new leaders and new religious groups have emerged that are testifying to the truth that religious expression is a vibrant part of the student experience, and we celebrate that. I'll just name that in 1998, the Hindu Student Association was born with volunteer support, including Dr. Kishore Trivedi, who's here today as the advisor. He's been here since the beginning of HSA. And in 2010, the Bryant Center dedicated space for Hindu students to pray alongside Buddhist students here on campus in a milestone that was under the care of the chapel of Dr. Christy Laura Sapp. And soon after, the community and the chapel, through these different initiatives, stepped up to raise funds for different chaplains and spiritual mentors. The first one was Usha Rajagopalan, and the next was Madhu Sharma, and now we have Chaplain Priya Amaresh. So we celebrate this leadership, these mentors that have accompanied students wherever they might be in their spiritual journey. And we as a chapel convene and continue to convene and support the rich tapestry of religious life as it emerges through student life here on campus. We now have 23 religious leaders who commit to a mutual project of respect and compassion and learning across religious traditions, while also caring for the spiritual well-being of students on campus. We believe in promoting events of interreligious engagement like this here. And some upcoming ones I'll actually have information on in the back. If you're a graduate student, I'll be leading an Interfaith Day Retreat. We also have an Interfaith Lunch Series where professors will be invited to reflect on the intersections of their intellectual and their devotional life. Dr. Das will be part of that, so a promo for that. I'll have some information in the back if you'd like to know about that. In all these moments, large and small, we seek to nurture the heart and the mind and the body and the spirit of students wherever they come from and wherever they are going. And so now I turn the microphone over to Chaplain Priya, who is the Buddhist chaplain, surprise, no. The chaplain for Hindu life here on campus has been since 2021 and has become part-time, a full employee here at Duke in 2023 after a commitment from the President's office to continue to fund Hindu life and Buddhist life here on campus. So we celebrate Priya and her teaching abilities, her chaplain abilities, the way she is walking with students now and in the years to come. Thank you.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you all here, and we're very honored today to have a very special guest visiting with us today at Duke University. Swami Medhananda is a wonderful acharya who's come to us from California just this weekend, so it's a pleasure to have him visiting and sharing his wisdom today. we welcome Swami Medhananda to Duke University, and we are excited that he's accepted this invitation to speak to our community about the ancient Vedic principles that are universal and evergreen. Concepts that are applicable to all and most relevant to our young students who are forging their independent ways into this world. I've been excited for this talk ever since Dr. Das suggested that we'll be hosting Swamiji, and the topic would be entitled, Same Goal, Different Paths. It always feels refreshing to be reminded that in spite of our endless differences in this world with diverse backgrounds, cultures, communities, and faiths, there is a way to exist harmoniously in this world. I've enjoyed watching several of Swamiji's videos in the past few months since I knew that he was coming, and especially the most recent one was the one entitled An Interview, Buddha at the Gas Station. That was a very interesting talk that was given. And so let me just share a little bit about our honored guest, Swami Medhananda, who comes with a very packed resume of academic and spiritual accomplishments in his life, in his young life, I should say. Swamiji was born in Boston, Massachusetts, into a culturally active Bengali American family. Surprisingly agnostic for a part of his young adult life, he went on to study world religions and philosophy in college and was a Fulbright Fellow in academic philosophy at the University of Berlin. Swamiji completed his PhD from Berkeley in philosophy with a specialization in German aesthetics. Look forward to hearing about that. Somewhere in the study of world religions and scriptures, teachings from the Bhagavad Gita made a strong impact, leading him to India to deepen his understanding of Sanatana Dharma. Since 2010, Swamiji has been an integral part of the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in Belur Math, Bengal, where he served as a professor and the head of the philosophy program. Swamiji is a monk of the Ramakrishna order. Since 2022, Swamiji has been serving as a senior research fellow in philosophy at the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood. His current research focuses on global philosophy of religion, religious epistemology, cosmopsychism, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and Vedantic philosophical traditions, especially the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. He is the author of 3 books, including Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism and The Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. And of course, he has countless articles written in spiritual journals over the years. He is currently writing a book on karma and rebirth in Hinduism, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press as part of a new series, Cambridge Elements in Global Philosophy and Religion. So without further ado, I welcome Swamiji to come to the mic, speak, share his wisdom, and guide us on to the right path. Our humble pranam, Swamiji.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'd like to thank Professor Holmes for kindly inviting me to the Duke Divinity School. Can you hear me? Is there any? Yeah. For kindly inviting me today. Professor Das as well for arranging the whole thing, and Hindu Chaplain Priya, I forgot your last name, I'm sorry. Priya Amarish.
And it's Reverend Bacon, Lester Bacon. Yeah.
Lester Bacon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lester Bacon.
Sorry, not Holmes. Yeah, it's my first time at Duke. It's a real privilege and an honor. I'm really excited about being here. So I thought we could just plunge into it. Religious pluralism is a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for a few decades now in theology and philosophy of religion. I think thanks in large part to the pioneering work of the British philosopher John Hick. And I've done quite a bit of work on John Hick's religious pluralism, especially in my book, Infinite Past, Infinite Reality. I'll mention that toward the end of the talk. But one thing that I find striking and still a bit troubling about contemporary discourse on religious pluralism is that it's almost entirely Western. And And the major players tend to be John Hick, Paul Knitter, Alan Race, typically male also, S. Mark Heim. We rarely hear non-Western voices in the conversation, and even non-male voices often. And so I think that's a shame. And I want to play a small role, at least, in trying to change that. And so let's begin in a small way with the talk today. I want to make a case that Sri Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism is an original and in many ways a philosophically sophisticated doctrine that I think contemporary philosophers and theologians should take seriously. I'm not gonna argue that it's the correct view or anything like that, that would be too crude. But that he should be part of the conversation. That's the case I want to make today. So, Sri Ramakrishna, who was he? He was a 19th century Bengali mystic and spiritual teacher. And if anyone knows anything about Sri Ramakrishna, you'll know that he's famous for teaching the harmony of religions. It's not just that he taught the harmony of religions. What's distinctive is that he practiced many different religious and spiritual traditions, which is somewhat unusual. He practiced within Hinduism many different traditions, including Tantra. So his chosen form of the deity was Kali, Mother Kali, that's a tantric goddess. But he also practiced Vaishnavism, which is devotion toward Krishna. He practiced a radically different form of Hindu philosophy called Advaita Vedanta, which is non-theistic, or if you prefer, supra-theistic. The ultimate reality, as we're going to find out a little bit later in the talk, according to Advaita Vedanta, is not personal. It's non-dual, pure consciousness. He practiced that path and claimed to have realized the goal of that path as well, which is merging his individuality in non-dual Brahman. Even more remarkably, after he practiced all these different Hindu traditions, he went on to practice Christianity and to practice Islam. So very eclectic as a spiritual practitioner, and he claimed to have realized ultimate truth, ultimate reality, through all of these different paths. Realizing the same ultimate reality in different forms and aspects through all these different paths, in both Hindu and non-Hindu religions. And on the basis of his varied spiritual practices and spiritual experiences, he famously taught Joto Mot Toto Pot. He was Bengali, so this is a Bengali teaching. It's translated as many fades, so many paths. Mot Pot. There are many different formulations. So the formulation is very succinct, and you might think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's not. There are a lot of nuances and complexities that I want to try to bring out in the course of this talk. So, the big question is, how exactly did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize the world religions? And I think that there are two major ways, at least, that we can misunderstand his views on the harmony of religions. So, let me begin with the wrong ways, I think, to interpret his view. The first common misconception about Ramakrishna's views is that he held that all religions are true. One example of a scholar who held this view, who holds this interpretation, is Frank Morales. And a second misinterpretation of Ramakrishna's view is that he harmonized the world religions on the basis of classical Advaita Vedanta, the classical school of non-dual Vedanta, according to which the common goal of all religious paths is the realization of non-dual, pure consciousness. This is, I think, a common misunderstanding of our tradition. They try to pigeonhole the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition into classical Advaita Vedanta, which was a school codified by Shankaracharya, the 8th century Advaitin Shankaracharya. So Swami Gireshnanda, who was a monk of our order, is one of many people who tend to interpret Ramakrishna's teachings on the harmony of religions through the lens of classical Advaita Vedanta, which I think does violence to the broadness and the subtleties of what Ramakrishna is actually saying. So, contrary to the first interpretation, the interpretation of Frank Morales and others that all religions are true, Ramakrishna did not hold that all religions are true, but he held that all religions are effective paths to the same goal of God realization, or realization of ultimate reality, if you don't like the terminology of God. So he didn't say that all religions are true in that sense. And second, with regard to the second misinterpretation, what's wrong with it? Contrary to the second view, the classical Advaitic interpretation, Ramakrishna never held that devotees of the personal God, theistic practitioners, must attain Advaitic realization of pure consciousness. So, if he was a classical Advaitin, he would have to say that the highest goal is realization of non-dual pure consciousness, but he doesn't say that. In fact, he allows for a theistic goal as an ultimate. You don't have to kind of go beyond the personal God to reach some kind of impersonal absolute, at least on Ramakrishna's teachings. So, to begin to get into some of these nuances in his views, I think it's helpful, even now, to have some familiarity with the theologian Alan Race's threefold typology of views on religious diversity. So, what is the relationship among the different world religious traditions? Many of you are familiar with this, I'm sure, but I'm just going to rehash this a little bit. And one issue with this typology is that different scholars interpret these terms in different ways, and so I'm just going to stipulate the definitions right up front. Okay, so exclusivism. Exclusivism is the view, yeah, maybe we can reduce the lighting here. Yeah.
Thank you. We're gonna attempt to see the lights.
Yeah.
There's also some over here, so I'll try these.
Okay.
The one that's illuminating the screen should be the one that should be. There we go.
Better?
Yeah.
That's a lot better. Yeah.
How many religious practitioners does it take for illumination?
Thank you.
Is that good?
That's great, I think it's a lot better, yeah, thanks. So, the threefold typology. My stipulated definitions for the purposes of this presentation. If you want more nuanced definitions, you can look at my books. Exclusivism. This is the view that only one religion leads to salvation, or the ultimate soteriological goal, while all other religions fail to lead to salvation. So, a quick example here would be the Protestant theologian Karl Barth, who held that Christianity alone leads to salvation, no other religion does. There's a second view in between exclusivism and pluralism, which I'll get to in a second, called inclusivism, religious inclusivism. This is the view that only one religion leads directly to salvation, but that other religions can lead indirectly to salvation or afford lesser forms of salvation. So it's not as narrow as exclusivism, but it's not as broad as pluralism. It's not as broad because it still has a kind of hierarchical way of thinking. There's a sort of language of higher and lower. My religion is the best or highest or most superior. Other religions aren't completely hopeless, but they're kind of stepping stones on the way to my best religion. An example on the Christian side would be the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who famously defended the view that non-Christians are what he calls anonymous Christians. So Hindus, Muslims can be considered anonymous Christians, meaning that they're Christians without knowing it, and that they receive God's or Christ's grace, even though they don't necessarily worship Christ by name, because Christ is so gracious. But you can see how there's still a kind of hierarchical thinking implicit in that kind of idea. On the Indian side, I think classical Advaita Vedanta is a pretty paradigmatic example of a religious inclusivist paradigm. And I'll explain in the next couple of slides why I think that's the case, so I'm not going to jump the gun, but stay tuned for that. Now, the third paradigm. This is what's called full-blown religious pluralism. This is the view, on my stipulated definition, that multiple religions, and note, I'm not saying all religions, multiple religions, more than one religion, is equally capable of leading to the highest soteriological goal. So on the Western side, you have people like John Hick and Paul Knitter. I'm sure you're familiar with them. And on the Indian side, I want to make the case that Sri Ramakrishna deserves to be considered and taken seriously as a sophisticated religious pluralist. So, as promised, I wanted to explain briefly why I think Advaita Vedanta is an inclusivist rather than a pluralist paradigm, as a way of kind of setting into contrast or setting into relief Ramakrishna's full-blown religious pluralist position. So, Shankara, as I said, 8th century Indian philosopher, who he didn't found the school is much older than he was, but he wrote very, very important and influential commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, on the three major Vedantic scriptures, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And so I think can best be considered the codifier of the school of Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta. If you want to put his philosophy in a nutshell. There's a famous Sanskrit formula to do so. It's Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmevana Paraha. Brahman alone is real. And by Brahman, he always means non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness. Brahman alone is real. Jagat Mithya. The world is ultimately non-existent. And then Jivo Brahmevana Paraha. The individual soul, the jiva, is none other than that non-dual pure consciousness. The only truth, the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness, and everything else is an illusion, including the fact that there are many different individuals here. Even that's an illusion. It's all part of this kind of collective dream. So Shankara distinguishes empirical from ultimate standpoints. And he says that from the empirical standpoint, all this diversity is true. But from the ultimate standpoint, the only truth is non-dual pure consciousness. And now moving to point 3. We attain liberation, moksha, by attaining knowledge of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. How do we do that? Through one particular yoga, spiritual practice, which he calls jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And I'm not going to go into the details, it's not that relevant here. But in any case, his claim is that there's only one yoga that takes us directly to the highest goal of liberation, and it's jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. So where does that leave other paths, other yogas, like bhakti yoga, the path of devotion, like karma yoga, the path of selfless action? He says, this is point 5, that bhakti yoga and karma yoga lead indirectly to liberation by purifying and concentrating the mind, thereby making us eligible to practice jnana yoga. So it's like you have to first get your high school diploma, and then you go on to college, and then you get your PhD. The PhD level stuff is jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. But to get there, you have to pass these earlier, you have to get these earlier diplomas through bhakti yoga and karma yoga. So they're kind of preparatory disciplines, you can say, the paths of devotion and selfless service, in order to ultimately become eligible to practice the highest path, which alone leads to the knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness, which is tantamount to liberation. So, Shankara himself was working within a Hindu milieu, and he didn't at least show any awareness of non-Hindu religions other than Buddhism, as far as I'm aware, in his commentaries. So he was not invested, nor was it sort of relevant in his time to try to address other world religions, like Christianity or Islam. But many modern Advaita Vedantins have tried to extrapolate a doctrine of religious diversity on the basis of his commentaries, basically. And they claim that you can harmonize all of the world religions on the basis of Advaita Vedanta. I'm thinking of people like Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. That's one prominent example. But there are others, T.M.P. Mahadevan and others from the 20th century. So what does it look like? When they say that we can harmonize the world religions on the basis of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, I've made a little diagram here to help us. The famous mountaintop. Through the practice of Christianity, Christians can realize the Christian God. Through the path of Islam, Muslims can realize God as Allah. Theistic Hindus, so devotional Hindus, through their respective spiritual paths, traditions, they can realize God as Rama, Krishna, Kali, Shiva, Ganesha, Hanuman, so on and so forth, you name it. But notice that none of them have reached the top of the mountain, unfortunately. They have realized various forms of the personal God. The term in Sanskrit is Saguna Brahman. Guna means qualities or attributes. This is Brahman, the ultimate reality with attributes. What are the attributes? The omni-attributes of the theistic God. Omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and so on. Omnipresence. But according to classical Advaita Vedanta, realization of the personal God is not sufficient for moksha, for liberation. You're still stuck in this samsara, this cycle of rebirth. Because they don't believe in an eternal heaven, Advaita Vedantas. They believe in temporary heavens, but you can't stay there for an eternity. So you have to eventually come back, take on another body, then finally become eligible to practice jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. And then through the successful practice of jnana yoga, you can finally attain the highest goal, which is the mountaintop, liberation. So what do Christians have to do? Eventually they have to stop practicing Christianity. And they have to practice jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. So I hope you're recognizing the inclusivistic structure, right? At least on my interpretation of classical Advaita Vedanta. Same goes for Muslims. Stop your theistic Islamic practices, practice Jnana Yoga, and then you'll reach the mountaintop, which is realization of your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Same goes even for theistic Hindus. Even within Hinduism, Advaita Vedantins say tough luck to theistic Hindus, because realizing Krishna and dwelling with Krishna in Goloka, some kind of heaven, not enough. That's not liberation. You're going to eventually have to come back. All right, so now, I say all this, as I said, because I think it helps set into relief what's distinctive about Ramakrishna's views on religious diversity, and why I think that Ramakrishna, it would be a mistake to think that he was a religious inclusivist along the lines of how I just sketched. He was a full-blown religious pluralist. And so for the remainder of the talk, I want to explain exactly what kind of religious pluralism he held. I think the key is his teachings on what he calls the spiritual states of jnana and vijnana. I think these teachings serve as the kind of philosophical and spiritual basis for his harmonizing of the world religions. So this is a quotation from his teachings. He says, the jnani, this is the person who has attained jnana, knowledge of non-dual Brahman, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Neti neti is a Sanskrit term. It's the Advaita Vedantic practice of saying that Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not my body, Brahman is not my mind, and so on. Only then can you realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. So you get up to the roof. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. The Vijnani realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof: bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is impersonal, the term here in Bengali is nirguna, which is the same in Sanskrit, is also personal, saguna. This is known as Vijnana. Okay, so there's a lot here to unpack. The Jnani is the classical or traditional Advaita Vedantin, along the lines of what I sketched in the previous slides, who attains spiritual realization of the impersonal, attributeless, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness, through the practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga. Okay? That's what Sri Ramakrishna likens to reaching the roof of a house, by leaving the steps behind one by one. And Ramakrishna says that the Jnani attains this in the spiritual state of what's called nirvikalpa samadhi, when you lose all external consciousness, and where Sri Ramakrishna also used the example of a salt doll. So imagine a doll made of salt, and imagine the salt doll's on a boat, and he wants to measure the depth of the ocean. So it sets foot in the ocean, but what happens to the salt doll when it enters the ocean? It dissolves in the ocean. So he says it's like that. The state of nirvikalpa samadhi is a state in which you merge your individuality in non-dual pure consciousness. There's no longer any subject-object duality. There's just non-dual Brahman. And that's it. So there's no question of a world, right? But then there's this issue. He says, now imagine that that person comes back from the state of nirvikalpa samadhi after attaining oneness with Brahman. What happens then? He says that there's a small minority of souls who can go on to attain an even greater and richer spiritual experience, which he called vijnana, vi. You just add the prefix vi before jnana and you get vijnana. It's a deeper knowledge of ultimate reality and ultimate truth. What's distinctive about the Vijnani? The Vijnani, instead of looking upon this world as a dream, instead of dismissing it as unreal, as ultimately non-existent, sees the world as a real manifestation of the divine. And the Vijnani does this, he or she has this outlook on the world because the Vijnani's realization, experience of God, of the divine, is more expansive than the Jnani's. The Jnani thinks of the divine only as non-dual and impersonal pure consciousness. The Vijnani thinks of that same divine as not only non-dual pure consciousness, impersonal, nirguna Brahman, but also as Shakti, or Saguna Brahman, the personal God, the theistic God, which is taught in all the Abrahamic religions and taught in all the theistic Hindu traditions as well. So the Vijnani has a kind of more expansive understanding of the divine as both personal, impersonal, as both formless and with form. So now, I argue in my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, that Ramakrishna's philosophy is best understood as a very expansive form of Advaitic philosophy. Advaita in the sense that it's non-dual. He believes that there's only one truth, one reality, and it's the divine. Call it God. But that God, or that divine, has both a personal aspect and an impersonal dimension. So the way he would put it in Bengali is Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman, by which he means non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness, is one with, is inseparable from Shakti, by which he means the theistic God with the omni attributes. They're just the static and dynamic aspects, respectively, of one and the same infinite divine reality. Second key doctrine, the world, this entire world of names and forms, and all individual souls are real manifestations of Shakti, of the personal God. This whole world is the divine play of Shakti. That's the Hindu view. Third, with regard to spiritual practice, and I want to highlight the contrast with Shankara's classical Advaita here. All four of the major yogas, Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion, Karma Yoga, the path of selfless action, and Raja Yoga, the path of concentration and meditation. All of these are direct paths to the goal of God realization, or realization of the divine. There's no hierarchy of yogas or religions or spiritual practices here, in the way you find in classical Advaita Vedanta, putting the path of knowledge on a higher footing than the path of devotion or Karma Yoga. So I would, in a nutshell, characterize his philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta as a Shakti-affirming and life-affirming Advaita philosophy. It's Advaita because he teaches that there's only one reality, which is God, but God has both impersonal and personal aspects. And so the way I would put it in Sanskrit would be Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. The ultimate truth is Brahma Shakti. It's Brahman in its static aspect, in its impersonal aspect, as pure consciousness, and it's Shakti, that same reality is Shakti in its dynamic aspect, when it creates this world. And because of that, Jagat Satyam. Instead of dismissing this world as an illusion, we can embrace this world as a real manifestation of the divine. So it's really more like panentheism. So now, how do we get to religious pluralism from this metaphysics of Vijnana Vedanta? He gives many different teachings on the harmony of religions, but my favorite is the following. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. God is infinite, and the paths to God are infinite. I like this teaching so much that the title of my book is inspired by this teaching, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. The reason why I like it is because, in a very succinct way, the first little phrase, God is infinite, explains why. It gives the rationale, the ontological rationale for the plurality of paths to God. If God himself or herself or itself is infinite, then it stands to reason that there are infinite paths to God. So it's a very simple kind of argument, right? Because God is infinite, there are also correspondingly infinite paths to God. What does it mean for God to be infinite? This is how I see Ramakrishna cashing that out. Devotees of the personal God, in Hinduism they're called bhaktas, theistic religious practitioners, through their respective religious paths realize some form or aspect of the personal, meaning the Shakti dimension of the impersonal, personal, infinite, divine reality. Christians will realize God the Father, or God as Christ. Muslims, God as Allah. Vaishnavas, God as Krishna, and so on. And so Shaktas, God as Kali, or as Shiva, and so on. On the other hand, Advaita Vedantins, who are not non-theistic, through the practice of the path of knowledge, Jnana Yoga, they don't want the realization of the personal God. That's not to them the highest goal. They attain the non-dual realization of Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, which is just the impersonal aspect, the static aspect of the same infinite divine reality. So it's the same reality, you can say, realized from different standpoints or something. He uses a really striking and original, I think, parable to explain the harmony of all religious and spiritual paths. This is the parable of the chameleon. So let me read it out to you. He says, once a man entered a forest and saw a small animal on a tree. He came back and told another man that he had seen a creature of a beautiful red color on a certain tree. The second man replied, when I went into the forest, I also saw that animal. But why do you call it red? It is green. Another man who was present contradicted them both and insisted that it was yellow. Presently, others arrived and contended that it was gray, violet, blue, and so forth and so on. At last, they started quarreling among themselves. To settle the dispute, they all went to the tree. They saw a man sitting under it. On being asked, he replied, "Yes, I live under this tree, and I know the animal very well. All your descriptions are true. Sometimes it appears red, sometimes yellow, and at other times blue, violet, gray, and so forth. It is a chameleon. And sometimes it has no color at all. Now it has a color, and now it has none." And then Sri Ramakrishna draws the following lesson from this parable. "In like manner, one who constantly thinks of God can know God's real nature. He alone knows that God reveals himself or herself to seekers in various forms and aspects. God is personal as well as impersonal, nirguna and saguna. Only the man who lives under the tree knows that the chameleon can appear in various colors, and he knows further that the animal at times has no color at all. It is the others who suffer from the agony of futile argument." So here again, there's a lot to unpack. I want to highlight four main features of this parable. Number one, what do the different colors of the chameleon signify? I think that they correspond pretty clearly to different forms of the personal God, of the theistic God. It could be Christ, it could be Krishna, it could be Ganesha, and so on and so forth. But secondly, what about the colorless chameleon? When the chameleon doesn't assume any color at all, that corresponds to non-dual, pure consciousness, the attributeless Brahman of classical Advaita Vedanta. And we can also throw in maybe Buddhist Nirvana, for instance. The third feature, notice, there's no hierarchy implied in the parable at all. The colorless chameleon is in no way more true or more authentic in some sense than the colored chameleon. Which means that the bhaktas, meaning the theistic practitioner's realization of the personal God, has the same status as the jnanis, the follower of the path of knowledge, the jnani's realization of non-dual pure consciousness. There's no higher and lower. It's not that the jnani is realizing a sort of a truer or more fundamental truth than the theistic religious practitioners. That's very important, that non-hierarchical thrust of this parable of the chameleon. And fourth, who is this mysterious person who apparently lives under the tree? Or is a tree sitter or something? This person represents Ramakrishna's Vijnani. This is the person who sees the chameleon throughout the day. What does that mean? It means this is the person, from a unique epistemic vantage point, realizes that God is Christ, but not just Christ. God is also Allah. God is also Krishna. God is also Kali. God is also Ganesha. So this Vijnani, the person sitting under the tree, has a more expansive knowledge and spiritual realization of the infinite divine reality. Okay, so that's very important to keep in mind. Which means that Ramakrishna, notice, he's the person sitting under the tree, right? That's the idea. So from his spiritual standpoint of Vijnana, he can say on the basis of his own spiritual experiences of God in different forms and aspects, that different spiritual and religious paths are equally valid paths to realizing the same goal. What's the goal? Realization of some form or aspect of the impersonal, personal, infinite, divine. So here's how I would render this diagrammatically, using the same mountaintop. Christians, through the practice of Christianity, can reach the very top of the mountain. They don't need to stop their practice of Christianity. They can go straight to the top, which is, for them, what's the goal? It's to realize God in some form. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Dwelling in a Christian heaven. That's the highest goal for them, and they get that through the practice of their Christian path. One can say the same about Muslims through the practice of Islam. They also reach the mountaintop, but in the form of realization of God as Allah, and dwelling in an eternal heaven, which they call Jannah, which is not the same heaven as the Christian heaven, but according to Ramakrishna, we can think of this final soteriological state as, I like to think of it as a many-roomed mansion, and I'll get to this in more detail a little bit later. So Christians, once they attain this final state, they can enter the Christian room, and they'll be in their Christian heaven, enjoying themselves. Muslims can enter the Muslim room, that's Jannah, and they'll be dwelling in their Muslim heaven. And Vaishnavas will have their Vaishnava room, and so on and so forth. And just as it's perfectly coherent for me to be speaking to you guys in this room, and for a different lecture or class to be going on next door, in the next hall, I see no reason or any kind of logical problem with there being multiple, equally ultimate states of salvation or liberation in this way. So I like the idea of a many-roomed mansion, which is also a Christian metaphor used by Christ. Hindus, through the practice of their respective theistic Hindu paths, can realize some aspect or form of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality. Again, the very top of the mountain. They don't need to stop their practice and practice the path of knowledge. Advaita Vedantins, through the path of knowledge, can also reach the top of the mountain. But for them, the top of the mountain is not realization of some form of the personal God, but realization of their true nature as non-dual, pure consciousness. And Buddhists, through the Buddhist path, can also reach the top of the mountain, but for them, they would characterize the ultimate goal as nirvana, the extinguishing of egoism or thirst. They tend to prefer to characterize the ultimate goal in negative terms, but that's equally the top of the mountain from a Ramakrishna standpoint. So, I already kind of hinted at this, but I want to just lay out a little bit more clearly. What exactly is Ramakrishna's conception of final liberation? I see it as a very expansive one. According to Ramakrishna, there are two fundamentally different types of spiritual aspirants. They're devotionally oriented people, called bhaktas in Hindu traditions, who strive to cultivate a loving relationship with some form of the personal God. And jnanis, followers of the path of knowledge, intellectually oriented people, like Advaita Vedantins and Buddhists, who strive for nirvana. Now, I don't mean to define the term in a very narrowly Buddhistic way here. It just means extinguishing of one's individuality in some higher reality. And that's true of both Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. So it's a salvific state in which no sense of individuality remains. There's no longer an individual in the state of salvation, or liberation, you can say. Now, in contrast to traditional schools of Vedanta, Ramakrishna grants equal value to both the non-dual and devotional ideals of liberation. I think this is really distinctive about his doctrine of religious pluralism, which you don't find even among other Hindu thinkers. And his view is that the form of liberation that we choose depends on our individual temperament and our individual preferences. The way he puts it, using a nice little metaphor, he says, bhaktas, meaning theistic religious practitioners, they don't want to become sugar. They want to eat sugar. So these are the two paradigms. Becoming sugar is one ultimate state of liberation, which is what Advaita Vedantins seek. So please look at the last bullet point. So some spiritual aspirants, like followers of the path of knowledge and Buddhists, they seek to merge their individuality in the impersonal, non-dual Brahman, pure consciousness. That corresponds to becoming sugar. You don't want to remain as an individual anymore. Individuality is the problem that you're trying to escape from. And so you don't reach the ultimate until you've completely dissolved your individuality, like that salt doll melting in the ocean. But there's another kind of equally valuable state of liberation or salvation. That's for theistic religious practitioners. Devotees. Devotees tend to prefer to retain a sense of individuality. They want to retain their I in some form, not in the sense of the ego that we know, sort of attached to this world, but a liberated individuality, because you need to retain some individuality in order to enjoy the bliss of God and to enjoy a loving relationship with God, which is what theistic practitioners are looking for, right? So, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is the most comprehensive record of Ramakrishna's teachings, one of his devotees asks the following question, Mohima Chakraborty, who is a follower of the path of knowledge, by the way, so it's not a coincidence. He's more along the lines of a classical Advaitic inclusivist who wants to say, bhakti is fine, theism is okay, but ultimately they need to come to my path, which is the path of knowledge, and then they can realize the highest truth, which is nirvana, understood as merging of individuality and non-dual pure consciousness. So that's the background that you have to keep in mind. So, this follower of Shankara asks the following question. I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? Notice the question. Doesn't a theistic religious practitioner also eventually have to give up his or her theistic practices and finally practice my path, which is the path of knowledge, and then attain the highest goal, which is not the theistic God, but non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness? That's the question. Ramakrishna answers emphatically in the negative. He says, it cannot be said that theistic religious practitioners, bhaktas, need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. Nitya Krishna ta nitya bhakta. Krishna is consciousness embodied, and his abode also is consciousness embodied. Chinmay Sham Chinmay Dham. Krishna is eternal, and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitya Krishna Nitya Bhakta. Again and again he's emphasizing. There's a salvific state which is ultimate. Think of it as a kind of eternal heaven, in which the liberated individual soul can dwell for an eternity with his or her beloved form of the personal God, whether that's Christ, whether that's Allah or Krishna or Kali. To illustrate this teaching, he uses another metaphor. He says, Satchit Ananda. What does Satchit Ananda mean? It's a Sanskrit term. It's a combination of three terms: Sat, Chit, and Ananda. Existence, consciousness, bliss. So it's a kind of epithet for infinite reality, according to Vedanta. He says, imagine, divine reality is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, one sees forms of God in the ocean of the Absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, theistic, religious, or spiritual aspirants, the lovers of God. But when the sun of knowledge rises, Gyanshuju, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before. Water above and water below, everywhere nothing but water. Let's pause for a second. Now, if the story ended here with the ice forms corresponding to different forms of the personal God, melting upon the rising of the sun of knowledge, then you confirm the classical Advaitic view, which I explained in the beginning of the presentation, which is that the forms of the personal God are not ultimately true. They're not the highest truth. You let them melt, and then you can realize the infinitude of non-dual Brahman. But the parable goes on as follows. Ramakrishna says, but you may say that for certain devotees, God assumes eternal forms, nitya shakar, Sanskrit, nitya sakara. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz. I think this is very, very important and striking. He says that these ice forms in certain places don't melt. They last for an eternity. That is the ultimate salvific goal for theistic religious practitioners who want to dwell in an eternal loving relationship with the personal God in a higher heaven. Since Ramakrishna conceives this divine reality expansively as both the impersonal, non-dual absolute, as well as the personal God, which he calls Shakti, his conception of the salvific goal of all religions, the highest soteriological goal, is equally expansive. For non-theistic spiritual aspirants like Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists, liberation consists in the total dissolution of one's individuality in non-dual pure consciousness, like the salt ball melting in the ocean, or nirvana. There's no trace of individuality left in that state of liberation. By contrast, Ramakrishna equally accepts that for spiritual aspirants in theistic religious traditions like Vaishnavism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, liberation takes the form of eternal loving communion with the personal God in a transcendental realm, in an eternal heaven. And since there are various lokas, that's the Hindu term for an eternal heaven, there are also multiple theistic forms of salvation. So this is what I'm likening to a many-roomed mansion. For instance, while devotees of Krishna can dwell eternally with their beloved Krishna actually this is not quite accurate, it's not Vaikuntha Loka, it would be Goloka or Vrindavana. Christians can dwell with Christ or God the Father in their Christian heaven. Muslims can commune with Allah in their eternal paradise called Jannah, and so on and so forth. And they're all, you can just imagine them as different rooms in the same mansion. So in short, this is the way I would sum it up. Ramakrishna was not only a religious pluralist who held that different religious paths are equally capable of leading to salvation, but he was also what I would call a salvific or soteriological pluralist, in that he held that salvation or liberation itself takes a variety of forms, depending on the temperament and preferences of different souls. So some of you who work in religious studies or theology or philosophy of religion might be aware of the work of S. Mark Heim, who's at Yale. He wrote a book called Salvations, with an S at the end, tellingly. So one of his main criticisms of John Hick's theory of religious pluralism is that it's a monolithic understanding of the final state of salvation, And S. Markheim says that does violence to the specificity of the different understandings of the final goal in the different world religious traditions. At the same time, I think Heim falls into a different trap because his view collapses back into what he calls pluralistic inclusivism. So it ends up being a kind of a dressed up form of inclusivism, which I think is problematic. At least Hick was a pluralist and a full-blown pluralist. So what I think is really distinctive about Ramakrishna is that he was a full-blown pluralist who accepted multiple forms of salvation. So he gets it, his theory has the advantages of S. Markheim plurality of salvations, but doesn't renounce the pluralistic dimension of Hick's project, right? So I think he kind of tried to get the best of both worlds. Hick's pluralism and S. Markheim's multiple salvations. Now, remember that the title of this talk was same goal, different paths, question mark. So I wanted to kind of leave the last few slides for the question mark, which is I want to raise some difficult questions for any theory of religious pluralism, but I wanted to explore how Ramakrishna would answer this difficult question. This is the famous problem of conflicting religious truth claims. So any proponent of religious pluralism has to face this problem. What's the problem? In a nutshell, this is the problem. If different religions make conflicting claims about historical and metaphysical realities, then how can all religions be valid? It's a really, really important question. So Hick gives an elaborate answer to this question in his magnum opus, An Interpretation of Religion, and Ramakrishna gives his own answers. So what are examples of this problem? Did Christ die on the cross? What do Christians say? Obviously, yes. Muslims say no. Conflicting truth claim. There has to be a fact of the matter. Christ either did die on the cross or didn't die on the cross. So if he did, Muslims are wrong. If he didn't, Christians are wrong. What does that mean for a religious pluralist? How do you explain that? Is rebirth true? This is a doctrine accepted by Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, but rejected by Orthodox Christianity, Orthodox Judaism, Orthodox Islam. Now, the key to understanding how Ramakrishna would respond to this problem of conflicting religious truth claims is the following. He never claimed that all religions are true. He claimed instead that multiple religions have maximal salvific efficacy. Multiple religions are equally effective in leading to the highest soteriological goal. That's his claim. So now with that in the background, I think it's very helpful to bring in John Hick's classification of 3 different kinds of conflicting religious truth claims. Historical truth claims, transhistorical truth claims, and claims about the ultimate reality. So number 1, Hick says there are disagreements about past historical events, quote, that are in principle accessible to human observation. An example would be the question of did Christ die on the cross? If we had a video camera or like an eyewitness at the time, which I'm sure there were, we could have just figured out, determined once and for all, empirically verified whether or not Christ died on the cross. Second kind of conflicting truth claim, disagreements about what Hick calls trans-historical matters, which cannot be verified by historical or other empirical evidence. This one doctrine that Hick suggests falls under this category would be the doctrine of rebirth. Although these days there's sort of mounting evidence presented by people like Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker that there is good empirical evidence, but it's still controversial. But in any case, rebirth arguably falls into this category. This is not something that you can just verify empirically whether it's true or not. Third kind of conflicting truth claim is disagreements about ultimate questions, meaning, for instance, what is the nature of ultimate reality? Different religions give different answers to these questions. So now, I would suggest that Ramakrishna adopts a particular stance toward the first 2 types, the historical and transhistorical truth claims that conflict. And he takes a different tack on the 3rd type, which is truth claims about ultimate reality. So let's look at, first of all, the first and second. So, regarding historical and transhistorical doctrines, he says that they are not soteriologically vital for everyone. Here's what he says. He says, that yearning, meaning that longing for God, vyakulata, is the whole thing. Whatever path you follow, whether you are a Hindu, a Muslim, a Christian, a Shakta, a Vaishnava, or a Brahma, the vital point is yearning. God is our inner guide, antaryami. It doesn't matter if you take a wrong path, only you must be restless for him. God herself will put you on the right path. Besides, there are errors in all paths. Everyone thinks his watch is right, but as a matter of fact, no watch is absolutely right. But that doesn't hamper one's work. So I think this watch analogy is very helpful. He likens each religious or spiritual path to a watch. No watch tells exactly the right time. Nowadays with GPS and smartphones, it's a little bit different. But in his time at least, no watch is exactly perfect. He says that every religion has at least some mistakes, but that those mistakes don't substantially detract from their salvific advocacy, their ability to furnish salvation, or the highest soteriological goal. So, for instance, Christians strongly believe that Christ is God incarnate and that he is the sole Son of God, right? They don't believe in multiple incarnations in the way that Hindus do. That's a very, very important doctrine for Christians. But Ramakrishna's take is, for non-Christians, even if it's true that God is Christ, even if they don't accept that, that doesn't necessarily hamper them in their practice of Hinduism or Muslims in the path of Islam. We know that Muslims don't accept that God was Christ, that Christ is God incarnate. But even if they reject that doctrine, and it's true that God was incarnate as Christ, Muslims can still practice Islam to their heart's content, and Islam is not salvifically handicapped in any way as a result of not accepting that doctrine of Christ as God incarnate. So that's just one example, but I hope you get the basic gist. Now, I think he takes a very different tack on the third type of conflicting truth claim. These are truth claims about ultimate reality. What is the nature of ultimate reality? Is it personal? Is it impersonal? Is God Allah? Is God Christ? Is God Krishna? Is God Hanuman? Is God Kali? From his philosophical standpoint and spiritual standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta, I think Ramakrishna's claim is that religious truth claims about ultimate reality are complementary rather than conflicting. And he uses another parable to explain this. The parable, it's well known to many people, it's not original to him, of the blind man and the elephant. Imagine an elephant, and there are 5 blind men touching different parts of the elephant. The blind man touching the trunk describes the elephant as dry and scaly. The blind man touching the tail describes the same elephant as furry and soft, and so on and so forth. They start quarreling with each other. One person comes who can see to intervene and says, stop your quarreling and your bickering. You're all right and you're all wrong. You're all right because you're touching genuine parts of the elephant. You're wrong in limiting the elephant to that part of the elephant that you're touching. The elephant is much vaster than you can even imagine. Okay? So this is exactly Ramakrishna's view. From the standpoint of Vijnana, the Vijnani has realized God as Christ, has also realized God as Allah, has also realized God as Krishna and Shiva and Kali and Vishnu and so forth, and as non-dual pure consciousness. And so he is in a unique epistemic position to intervene in religious disputes, basically, about what the nature of alternate reality is. And he says they're not conflicting, they're in fact complementary, because they're just different forms and aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality. And to sum up, I wanted to mention what I see as 4 key advantages of Ramakrishna's Vijnana-based religious pluralism. And as I said, the aim today is not to prove to you all that this is the best view, but that he deserves a place at the table in contemporary theological and philosophical discussions of religious pluralism and religious diversity. So, first advantage. The major world religions are equally effective paths to realizing some aspect or form of one and the same impersonal, personal, infinite reality. So it's a full-blown religious pluralism. It's not there's no implied hierarchy. It's not inclusivistic in structure. It's a genuine religious pluralism. Second advantage, since the personal God and the impersonal absolute are different but equally real aspects of one and the same infinite divine reality, theistic and non-theistic religions are placed on an equal ontological and soteriological footing. Because God is equally personal and impersonal, the theistic paths throughout the world and non-theistic paths throughout the world are on an equal footing. There's no hierarchy there. Third, he champions a very expansive understanding of the final state of salvation or liberation. Instead of imposing a single, narrow soteriological goal onto all of the world religions, Ramakrishna holds that a theist can dwell in an eternal heaven with the personal God, and remember there are multiple heavens as well. There's the Christian heaven, there's the Muslim heaven, Jannah, there are various Hindu lokas. While an Advaita Vedantin or a Buddhist can merge his or her individuality in non-dual pure consciousness, and they're equally salvific, equally ultimate. And finally, Ramakrishna's broad conception of the impersonal, personal, infinite reality provides an ontological rationale for active interreligious dialogue. So here the idea would be, each one of us, if I'm a Christian, I can stand to learn a great deal from other religions. Why? Because other religions can teach me something about the nature of God, the infinite divine, which is not taught at all, or is taught in a kind of less explicit way in my own home religious tradition. Because God is infinite, remember, that's one of Ramakrishna's key tenets. He says again in another way, you can never place a limit to God, which means, even if I believe in God as Christ, by learning about Hindu traditions, I can learn about how that same God that I worship, not only manifests as Christ, but also manifests as Krishna and as Kali and as Shiva, and also has a non-dual, pure consciousness dimension as well. So if you're interested in more in-depth discussion and a little bit more rigor, I recommend you look at chapters 3 and 4 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2018. Chapter 3 is a detailed reconstruction of Ramakrishna's views on religious pluralism, what I explained today. Chapter 4 is a very detailed discussion of John Hick's views on religious pluralism. And I bring John Hick into dialogue with Ramakrishna. And one of the things that I'm doing that is very controversial and I think original is I'm defending a diachronic interpretation of John Hick's views on religious pluralism. Most people think that when Hick adopted pluralism, that religious pluralist view remained static throughout his life. I claim that he held two different forms of religious pluralism. One in phase 1, which is between 1970 and 1974-ish, and then another after 1970, starting mainly in 1976. And that Hick's early view of religious pluralism comes closest to Ramakrishna's view, but that he moves away from that view to adopt a more Kantian version of religious pluralism that you find in his prominent works like An Interpretation of Religion. So I bring Ramakrishna into dialogue with John Hick in chapter 4, if you're interested in that. And just to mention, there's a book symposium published on my book, Infinite Paths, in 2021 in the International Journal of Hindu Studies, where 13 theologians and philosophers and some historians wrote responses to my book, and then I wrote a final response. And there's a lot of interesting discussion of chapters 3 and 4. Some people pushing back on certain aspects of my reconstruction, and to some extent I changed, in relatively minor ways, some aspects of my reconstruction. So if you're interested in details, you can look at that book symposium. And finally, my newer book is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. Vivekananda, as some of you know, was the chief disciple of Ramakrishna. And he also taught the harmony of religions. Many people think that he taught the harmony of religions from the standpoint of Shankara, from the standpoint of classical Advaita Vedanta. And I'm arguing that he doesn't, that in fact he follows his master, Ramakrishna, in teaching the harmony of religions from the spiritual standpoint of Vijnana. I do that in chapter 3 of my book, so if you're interested, you can look at that as well. Thank you very much.
Questions for Swamiji?
I noticed that the book that you had, Infinite Paths, it said Oyon Maharaj. Is
Yeah.
that your another name?
That was my name before I got sannyasa. Yeah. Yeah. That's me. Same person.
Swamiji,
Yeah.
can I answer one clarification after hearing the lecture?
Do we have a mic for speakers, or is that not?
Yeah, if you don't mind repeating the question.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
All right.
The question is that in this presentation you said that the different yogas, the Bhakti Yoga and the Karma Yoga is a preparatory course for the Jnana Yoga.
According to classical Advaita Vedanta.
But if you read Narad Bhakta Sutras, he emphasizes Bhakta Yoga as a little step notch higher than Jnana Yoga, because the reason is that Jnana Yoga is not very affirmative about the reality of God. They say neti neti and they give on eliminating, the process of elimination. But Bhakta Yoga, we are definite that the existence and the reality, and then the Bhakta approaches the Bhakta Yoga for the salvation.
Yeah.
Now here is a little contradictory thing which I want to clarify.
Okay, as far as I can understand your question, you're saying that different religious traditions within Hinduism defend different kinds of hierarchies. And I presented one of them, which is from the classical Advaitic standpoint. They're putting on a lower footing theistic religious paths. You're pointing out Narada's Bhakti Sutras, which is kind of doing the opposite. It's turning the tables on Advaita Vedanta and saying that Bhakti is superior, the path of knowledge is inferior. That's true. These games and these hierarchies have been going on for centuries. And my whole point is that Ramakrishna's intervention, why it's so important, is because he says, enough of these hierarchies. Jnana Yoga and Bhakti Yoga have equal salvific efficacy, and we've had enough of these games of hierarchies and higher and lower. Let's accept everyone on equal footing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Two questions, please. Thank you, first of all, for your very stimulating talk. I'll go away from here today with two images, that of the mountain and that of the multi-room mansion house.
Yeah.
And I will find myself trying to reconcile them. I wonder if that's the wrong way to go, but rather to hold both in some sort of paradoxical way in tension with one another. They're both true, even though they signal different realities. My second question is...
Can we pause? Because
Sure.
every time people ask two questions, I forget the first one.
Okay.
And if you don't mind repeating the question.
Yeah,
I'm
it's a
afraid
great...
I'll forget my second question.
Okay, yeah, no, so I'm giving you the responsibility to remember your next week. So, okay, so you see at least a prima facie tension between the mountaintop metaphor, which implies a kind of a single monolithic goal for all the world religions, and the, not the chameleon, right? What was the second metaphor that you...
The house.
Oh, the many-room mansion, yeah, which suggests that there's a multiplicity of salvations, right? Yeah, I think that's great. There's a reason, there's a method to my madness. The reason why I still like the mountain metaphor is because Ramakrishna does claim that there is a single common goal. That's why same goal, different paths. What is that goal? He defines that single goal in a very expansive manner. That's the way to reconcile these two things. What is that manner? That mountaintop is the many-room mansion. So it's a big mountaintop, and so it accommodates a massive mansion with many rooms. So does that allay your doubts, or is there a kind of a follow-up?
No.
Okay.
I'm happy with that. I think it was Langston Gilkey talks about relative absolutes. So there are many different absolutes.
Yeah.
But they're all relative to their own particular.
That's nice. I mean, my only follow-up question for him would be, what do you mean by relative? Because the moment people use words like relative, it might mean it's only true from an empirical standpoint, or it's subjective in some sense. But I think
Well, it's
Ramakrishna...
relative to the tradition that holds it.
Right, but is it fully true and real and ultimate?
Well, rather than thinking of a singular mountain, why don't we think about a mountain range?
Range, with different mountains.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the thing is, I still think it's important to Ramakrishna's view that you're all realizing one and the same divine. One and the same divine, but just in different forms and aspects. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not polytheism. It's a monotheism, and it's not just monotheism, it's a monism. I mean, there's just one truth, there's one reality, it's the divine. But that divine is defined in a very extensive way.
That's a good segue. I do remember my second
Number two,
question.
yeah, please.
It's often said, I believe, that everybody gets to define themselves. I get to define myself and my tradition. Others get to define their traditions. He's defining, like an inclusivist, like the problem with Karl Rahner, saying that other religions exist within the salvific efficacy of Christ.
Sure.
He's defining other traditions according to him, so he's not allowing others to define their own. I feel like the same criticism could be leveled here, and I'm curious how you address it.
Yeah, that's great. So the question is, to what extent does Ramakrishna do violence to or fail to honor the self-understanding of the different world religious traditions? Is that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, sure. It's a question that I explain in detail in chapter 3 of this book, Infinite Passing from Reality, but to give a kind of summary. I think every theory of religious pluralism has to bite the bullet on this to a certain extent in order to be a coherent theory of religious pluralism. There has to be some meta framework, some underlying framework, on the basis of which one can explain how multiple paths can have equal salvific efficacy. And so there's a kind of minimal commitment to certain doctrines, like the divine is not just impersonal but also personal. Now, does Orthodox Christianity or Islam or Judaism accept that? No, right? Oh, it's complicated, maybe. Yeah, it depends. It depends on who you're talking to, maybe. But Advaita Vedanta, as far as I can tell, certainly does not accept that the personal God is ultimately real, for instance, right? So that might be a more cut and dried kind of example, something that's problematic. Yeah, that's true. And so what Ramakrishna does is he says the following: I accept the core doctrines about ultimate reality in all the different world religious traditions, to the extent that they affirm a genuine aspect of one and the same infinite divine reality. I part ways with them the moment that they start making exclusivistic claims. That God is only Christ, or God is only Allah, or the divine is, or the ultimate is only non-dual pure consciousness. He says, I reject your only. He rejects the only of every exclusivistic religious tradition. He rejects the hierarchies of every inclusivist religion. So there is a sense in which he denies the self-understanding, certain aspects of the self-understanding of some religious traditions. But that's precisely in order to ground a coherent religious pluralist position. He has to deny inclusivism and exclusivism in order to affirm a coherent religious pluralist position. Thank you very much. Excellent question. You must be a faculty member, am I right? Or no?
No.
Oh, no, okay. That's smart questions. Appreciate it, thank you, yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I have two questions again, so I'll ask one first, one at a time. So one is that this notion of that fellow sitting under the tree, isn't he at a different level? So there is a hierarchy of some kind, isn't it?
Yeah, oh, that's great. That's a nice question. So the question is, with regard to the chameleon parable, this man sitting under the tree, isn't he in some sense superior to, or enjoy a kind of superior perspective to, the poor souls who can only see the chameleon in one color, or no color at all? So I think the answer to this question is, we have to distinguish forms of, I don't even like the word superiority here, privileged standpoint maybe. In what sense is that person privileged? What I'm saying is relevant in Ramakrishna's doctrine of religious pluralism is whether he champions a hierarchy of religious paths. That's the important thing. Do multiple religious paths have equal salvific efficacy? And the man sitting under the tree, he's not saying that his special path, whatever that might be, the Vijnana path, is somehow superior to the path of Jnana or Bhakti or Christianity or anything like that. So it's not a pernicious hierarchy, and it's not inclusivistic in the way that I think is problematic, as defined in the beginning of my presentation. Do you see what I mean? So it's hierarchical in this sense that he has a more expansive understanding of God, but he's not saying it's mandatory to sit where he's sitting.
He's not claiming that he's...
Well, no, he's claiming that when a Christian comes and says God is Christ, he says, yes, I agree with you, O Christians, because I've realized God is Christ too. But never say that God is only Christ and cannot be Allah. And never say that God cannot be Krishna. So he enjoys a more expansive knowledge of God, but that's not a salvific hierarchy. That's just, it's like somebody who's visited one continent as opposed to somebody who's visited 6 continents. Greater knowledge, but they're both equally inhabitants of this earth. Something like that.
And the second is, there is a fellow called Stephen Protero.
Yeah, Prothero, yeah.
His has view of multiple mountain tops,
Yeah.
and that Ramakrishna and Gandhi, and they're all lying to us or something of
Yeah.
that nature.
Yeah, Frank Morales and Steve Prothero are both kind of cut from the same cloth. So they're both defending this. I'm going to go back to the very beginning of the talk. They defend this. Oh, that first view, that all religions are true. What they're ascribing, I think that they're both kind of creating a straw man out of Ramakrishna. They're saying Ramakrishna defended the view that all religions are true, which is a crazy idea, because obviously different religions make conflicting religious truth claims. Islam says Christ didn't die on the cross, Christianity says Christ did die on the cross, and so his view is nonsensical. But they also both use this idea of mountaintops, and they say that the truth is, there's a Christian mountaintop, there's a Christian mountain, as you were kind of saying, the mountain range, right? And there's an Islamic mountain with a different goal, with a different mountaintop. There's a Vaishnava mountain, there's an Advaita Vedanta mountain, there's a Buddhist mountain, and they're all different. That would be truer to the facts. And the reason why, this is coming back to your question, sir, actually, which is that it's important that everybody reach the same mountaintop, even though that mountaintop itself is very broad. Because that's a way of reconciling these two things. In a sense, there are multiple salvific goals. Because the Buddhist goal is nirvana, because the Advaitic goal is non-dual pure consciousness, because the Christian goal is the Christian heaven, the Muslim goal is Jannah, in that sense. But they're not different mountains. They're all realizing different aspects and forms of the same infinite divine. And so there's still there's a unity within the diversity. That's what's important. So I think he's doing something very kind of dialectical here. On the one hand, he's positing a single soteriological goal for all the different spiritual paths. On the other hand, he's defining that single goal in a very expansive way to accommodate multiple salvations. Thank you.
You mentioned that Ramakrishna practiced tantra, so I'm curious what that practice is like. And also about the paths, it's so much about like thinking, right? And so many people in general wouldn't be familiar with the goal, nirvana, these many ultimate realities. So in terms of practice, what does Ramakrishna think about different paths?
Okay. The first one, I understood the first question better than the second one. So the first question is just about what were his tantric practices. His first guru was a kind of Vaishnava tantric, Bhairavi Brahmani, a woman, a female sannyasi, and she put him through some of the standard tantric practices. Some of them he couldn't actually do because of his particular religious commitments, and so you're supposed to drink wine, but he couldn't. And there's sort of meditating in a graveyard, and there's one where you're supposed to have, I think, intercourse with a woman, but he couldn't do that either, and so instead, there are different practices. Like one is he sat on the lap of a beautiful young woman, and then he immediately went in the state of samadhi. And there are those kinds of examples. But the main thing is that tantric traditions teach the reality of Shakti and Shiva. And so it's really, I think, partly because of that influence in the spiritual experience that he taught that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. So his teachings are based on a very broad range of spiritual practices, including his practice of Tantra. And the second question I just didn't quite understand.
Never mind, the first question answered it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I have a very basic question from an unrealized person. What is the biggest takeaway that I take from here today, other than the infinite paths, trying to learn from every religion, trying to understand the mountaintop and the multiple rooms, and also the different yogas that can be done that can enhance my understanding of the infinite? What is the punchline that I should take from here?
I think you characterized the punchline quite well, and if you've taken away that much, I think that's enough. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, the only thing I want to do is, it's easy to, in the context of religious pluralism, it's easy to slip into pieties, like feel-good pieties. It's nice to say that all the different religious traditions lead to the same goal. It's hard to defend it in a rigorous way. So what I'm trying to do is bring some rigor, some sophistication and rigor, to an understanding of how different religious paths can coherently be equally salvific. That's the idea. Yeah, back there, and then we'll go to the end.
Studies show more and more people are turning away from religion in the United States, and they define themselves as religious nuns. Do you have any idea as to why increasingly more and more people are turning away from God? And how do you suggest one can turn back to God and find their relationship with God?
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, yeah, I read an article.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. So, thanks. So the question is, a recent study shows that more and more people, I think it was done in the US, right, are identifying as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, which means no religion. But interestingly, I read that article, or the article I read about this study at least, says that those same people didn't deny that they were spiritual. So I actually think that this kind of is sort of vaguely similar to the spiritual but not religious kind of category and affiliation, SBNR. More and more people these days are identifying as SBNR, spiritual but not religious, or I'm not religious. Why? Partly because religion has gotten a bad name. Religion tends to be associated with religious fundamentalism. I think that people who are the most kind of card-carrying religious people tend to be the most proselytizing, off-putting, fanatical sometimes, looking down on you, threatening you with hell. And so the young generation is like, I've had enough of this. if I call myself religious, am I really buying into all this? I don't want to. So better not to call myself religious at all. So I think it's to some extent a kind of polemical reaction against religious fundamentalism. And what's the, I don't know if your question is about the solution, but what's the way to bring some people back? I've got a lecture, if you're interested, on YouTube called Spiritual But Not Religious ? So I talk about this in detail. But I think that Vedanta, I mean, the view that I've been expounding today actually lends itself well, and it appeals to people who identify as both religious nuns and as spiritual but not religious, precisely because it gives a kind of underlying philosophical rationale for how any religion can be true, but minus the fundamentalism, minus the exclusivism. So Vedanta asks you to commit to very, very, I think, minimal sorts of ontological commitments. Like one is just that every religious path is interested in a belief in some kind of higher power, and even if higher power is not right, some kind of ultimate goal, some kind of ultimate soteriological goal, defined very expansively. And if you accept that, and then you accept that there are multiple paths, multiple spiritual practices that lead to the realization of that goal, that's Vedanta in a nutshell. That's all you really have to accept. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of SBNRs might be open to that. And even religious nuns might be open to that possibility. Yeah, thank you. Back there.
Thank you very much for your presentation here. Just to situate myself in relation to my question, Frank Cooney was my academic mentor, and Swami Medhananda was my pastoral mentor.
Oh, cool.
I got a MDiv in Hinduism.
Mm-hmm. At Harvard Divinity School, yes. Yeah.
So just to say, I again, two questions. The first one's kind of silly and quick, so I'll ask both at the same time. But is there a particular reason that you translated Shakti as God and not goddess? The second is to bring up some ideas that I've heard from two lines of questioning so far, and try to tie them to action, community, communication, the dialogue. I agree fully that voices like yours are necessary in these kinds of discussions. They're often reduced to straw men or false versions and then discarded. So I'm very glad that this is here. But again, the question of, in order to be taken seriously, or at least listen to the end of a message across some of these divides of difference, not only in maybe a similar mountaintop, but in the different paths up them. What if the path is the mountaintop? Things like that. What if there is a way in which the exclusivism is, you can't remove it from the tradition without undoing the tradition entirely. How then do we engage these conversations fruitfully, from whichever perspectives we might come to that table? If the table isn't set by the person under the tree or the sighted man approaching the elephant, right? How do we do that? Is there maybe verbs more than adjectives?
Verbs more than adjectives. Okay, so two questions. I think the first question is simpler to answer than the second. The first question is, when I use the term Shakti, why do I define it as God, as opposed to goddess? And my answer is, I hope I never defined it as God or goddess. Because I just define it as personal God. And personal God can be he or she, goddess, or, I'm defining it very broadly because I think he does. He's just taking Shakti to mean the theistic God. Whether that's the male, any number of the male gods, or the female deities, goddesses. Yeah. So Shakti in a very capacious way. I think it would be a mistake to just take Shakti to mean something like Kali, because that's another form of narrowing his doctrine, I think. Yeah. Okay. So that's with regard to the first question. The second question is sort of along the lines of what this gentleman was asking about to what extent does Sri Ramakrishna honor the self-understanding of the different world religions and
that type of conversation.
Yeah, in interreligious dialogue and conversation, might that be a stumbling block? Look, like I think that this is an issue for every whether you're an exclusivist or an inclusivist or a pluralist, right? So they're just different stumbling blocks, and I think we should acknowledge all of them. The exclusivist has a pretty major stumbling block, which is that he looks down on other religions and thinks that they're hopelessly wrong. Usually, that's like maybe the worst form of exclusivism. But in any case, there's still this doctrine of my religion alone is true and salvific, and yours are either false or much less true than mine, and don't lead to the highest goal. That's a huge stumbling block. Okay, a comparatively not so bad stumbling block is the stumbling block for inclusivists in these interreligious conversations. S. Markheim's one of them, and he bites the bullet and says, I'm an inclusivist. So does Frank Clooney, as a Catholic Jesuit. So what's that? So what's the bullet there? The bullet is Catholicism is the best, Kalakana as well, and other religions are not hopeless, and they might even attain the highest goal, but by the grace of my Christ, right? And so there's still a higher and a lower. And so that's the stumbling block for inclusivists. And so now you're asking, well, isn't there a stumbling block for pluralists like Ramakrishna as well? And I think that in a sense, it depends on what you mean by stumbling block, right? Does he fully honor the self-understanding of all religious traditions? No. And I don't think it's a problem, because if he did, it wouldn't be a coherent theory of religious pluralism. He can't coherently accept the full-blown exclusivism of a Gavin da Costa or a Kalbat, and at the same time coherently defend his own religious pluralism. He has to reject the exclusivistic elements and the inclusivistic elements in the world religious traditions in order to champion religious pluralism. Now, is that too high a cost? Maybe that's the question. Well, the thing is, what's happening now? Let's look at the global situation. There's killing going on, and bloodshed going on in the name of religion throughout the world. And it's been going on unabated for centuries. And I think it's important to do whatever we can to reduce that bloodshed and that violence and that religious strife and conflict. I think one way of doing that is to find some common ground across the world religious traditions. And I think that religious pluralism, that's why I think that it's such a promising position. I think that after millennia, Catholicism, the fact that it's moved away from exclusivism to inclusivism, right, in Nostra Aetate, is a very promising step, but I don't think we've gone far enough. And you might be familiar with Perry Schmidt-Leukel. He's a German theologian. He's a friend of mine. So he's, for decades, been arguing with Frank Clooney about this. Because Schmidt-Leukel is a Protestant religious pluralist, and Clooney is a Catholic Jesuit inclusivist. And Schmidt-Leukel is saying it's good. You've gone, you've come a long way, but you need to come to our standpoint of religious pluralism to really fully embrace the salvific efficacy of multiple religious traditions. And so I'm sort of more sympathetic to that standpoint. Thank you. Yeah.
So I've heard a few of your lectures on YouTube, and in one of the lectures you used the word that Vedanta is you coined the word as a meta religion, and I felt like the punchline that one of my other colleagues here was asking about is, to me, I felt that coinage really put things into perspective for me when you said when you used that word meta, like the meta Christians or meta.
I like that.
Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah, sure, thank you. That actually helps, and it actually helps me answer the young lady's question in the back of the room about religious nuns and spiritual but not religious. I like to think of Vedanta as a meta-religion, M-E-T-A religion, which means it furnishes the underlying rationale of all the religious traditions. And it does so on the basis of a few philosophical doctrines, the ones that I've already laid out. But the idea is, a religion in its own right is something that has a very elaborate kind of superstructure. And there are all sorts of commitments that it makes about whether Christ died on the cross or didn't die on the cross, do you believe in rebirth, this and that. Vedanta says, let's just bracket all that. Let's get to the foundation of all of these different religious superstructures. What is that foundation? There's one ultimate reality, which different religious traditions call by different names and describe in different ways from different standpoints. That's the first key tenet. And second, there are a plurality of paths to realize some aspect or form of that one infinite divine reality. That's it. That's the entirety of this meta-religion. It doesn't ask you to have any further, more specific commitments. If you accept that, you can freely be a Christian to your heart's content and accept the whole Christian superstructure, or be a Muslim to your heart's content and accept the Muslim superstructure, and so on and so forth. You can take your pick of religious superstructure, as long as you can accept the fundamental tenets of that underlying Vedantic meta-religion. And of course it's controversial, and I'm not saying that's going to be easy to convince everybody of it. I hope that's not, I'm not implying that anywhere. But I think that's less of a steep uphill battle than an exclusivist trying to convince, a Christian exclusivist trying to convince non-Christians that their religion is actually inferior to Christianity. At least you're putting all the religions on an equal salvific footing. So I think that's a more productive starting point for each religious conversation. Thank you.
I think we'll wrap this up now.
Thanks a lot for the great question.
hope everyone is still doing well. I think we've all been blown away with this talk, so I want to thank Swami Medhananda for this insightful talk. I'm Samrat Das. I'm an associate professor of pediatrics at the School of Medicine, and I'm the current president of the Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of North Carolina. I really like to thank the Duke School of Divinity and Religious Life at Duke and Hindu Life at Duke and the Duke Chapel for making this event possible, and especially Reverend Catherine Lester Bacon and Hindu chaplain Priya Amresh. We need to have more of these kind of discussions, and again, this event is a testament to Duke's effort in providing true diversity on campus, and this was a true testament of that. So thank you all for coming, and we have some Indian snacks outside the room, so please have some snacks on the way out. And then we have a small center, Ramakrishna Vedanta Society of North Carolina has a small center in Morrisville. Our website is vedantanc.org. Feel free to go onto the website to get a sense of the kind of events we host. And thank you all for coming.
Oh, thank you.